Consider the fact that even people behind bars are human beings just like you, and they need to get treatment, and they need to not get sick, and they do not deserve to die because of medical neglect and because of the oversights that we've done for decades in the state.
You're listening to Law and the Pandemic, a production of UC Hastings Law School and its Center on Legal Technology and Innovation, LexLab. We're your co-hosts. I'm Drew Amerson.
And I'm Arika Smith. Today, we asked Professor Hadar Aviram why we should care about the threat of COVID-19 in California prisons. Professor Aviram is an expert in criminal justice, civil rights, and social movements. She's the author of Yesterday's Monsters, the Manson Family Cases, and the Illusion of Parole, which examines the California parole process.
We invited you here because a lot of your research and writing has been on the criminal justice system and reforms that are needed there. And we were hoping you could talk about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on prisons, but I actually want to start by sort of flipping that and asking you why people, even people who don't have any seeming connections to the prisons, should care about the threat in prisons.
I'm so glad you asked, because I think that prisons are a major piece of what we need to do to overcome this virus, and it hasn't been so far receiving the kind of attention that it deserves. Essentially, what's going on is that prisons, for reasons that I'm happy to explain, are petri dishes for this virus. We've now had the first casualty in a California prison, in Chino Prison. We have hundreds of inmates infected. We've had dozens of staff infected. And staff, of course, as opposed to the prisoners, are people who go in and out of the prison. And if you have basically petri dishes for the virus, 33 of them all around the state of California, and that's not including the jails, the detention facilities, and there are people going in and out, whenever people in prison are at risk, all of us are at risk as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually just saw today, even states like Ohio, and now I'm learning California, which had early shelter-in-place orders, the places in Ohio that are actually blowing up right now happen to be around where there are prisons. And I think that you're right that petri dish is impacting that.
So that's not surprising at all. And I think that we have to thank for that for decades of, inaction, decades of poor planning, and a lot of good intention things that we've done along the way to try and alleviate overcrowding that's actually impacting why prisons are so vulnerable to the virus right now.
Can you expand on that a little bit? I would just assume if we've addressed overcrowding, it wouldn't be as big an issue.
Sure. So the best way to think about this is perhaps to think back of something that Ben Bernanke, the director of Federal Reserve, said in 2012 when he was explaining the financial crisis of 2008. And he said it was a function of triggers and vulnerabilities, right? The trigger is the fact that the housing bubble burst, but there was also a lot of, lack of supervision and a lot of lax, regulations around the way that financial markets did. I think this metaphor works really well for explaining what happened in prisons, because essentially what we have now is a trigger, which is the virus and the legal response to the virus, which I can talk about later. But the trigger is happening already at a place where there's deep vulnerabilities that go back decades. So here in California, I would say we can break the vulnerabilities down into three parts. We can talk about what happened before the big healthcare lawsuit in California exploded, Brown versus Plata. We can talk about the ways in which the state of California tried to overcome overcrowding after Plata. And we can talk about the political culture in California and how that's making things more complicated. So let me start with the first piece. So up until 2010 or even 2011, California prisons were obscenely overcrowded. So basically speaking, there were twice as many people in the facilities as the facilities were built to hold. You would see pictures of the San Quentin gym. You would see pictures of hallways full of triple bunks because there was just no place to put people. The prison was just stuffed to the gills with people. Long sentences, short sentences, just way, way, way too many people. One of the outcomes of the overcrowding was that it made it impossible to provide people even minimal health care. So once every 6 days, a prisoner in California would die from a completely preventable disease, most of the time exacerbated by the deficient health care. And here's why. When there's a lot of overcrowding, there's a lot of queues. So people don't get their medical treatment on time, they get worse, and of course they then need more urgent and more expensive treatment. Every time people are taken to a medical appointment, everything has to be put on lockdown, which is very complicated with a lot of people. You pack people like sardines in close proximity, people are going to get sick because they're going to infect each other. People are going to get violent because they don't have personal space, and that also means people need medical attention. Pharmacies were a joke, the administration was not functioning, they didn't have a registry. The whole system was dysfunctional. Around 2006, 2007, the federal courts went as far as to take the healthcare system out of the prisons and give it to a federal receiver. And even that didn't do the trick. Until in 2009, a 3-judge federal panel ordered the California prisons that they had to reduce the population from a 200% capacity to a 137.5% capacity. Why 137.5 is a long story, but even that is a lot more than what the prisons are equipped to pack, right? The state, rather than embracing this as an opportunity, resisted at every turn. Jerry Brown at the time was the Attorney General, just litigating until the case got all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 2011, the Supreme Court approved the 3-judge panel ordered and said, you California prisons have got to decarcerate. You have got to reduce the population from 200% to 137.5. And how did we go about it? Well, the way we went about it was introduce a legal reform that is known as the criminal justice realignment. Basically, we took a bunch of offenses that are non-serious, non-violent, and non-sexual, known colloquially as the non-non-nons, and all those people were taken out of California prisons, and they would serve their sentence in local jails. And the idea was, first of all, local jails, the person's going to do the sentence in their community, there's going to be more of a continuum of care. It does make a lot more sense. People get sent to prison, by the county, so it makes sense for the county to pick up the price tag. But the other thing was that people were thinking, well, the healthcare system in state prisons is so abysmal, it can't possibly be worse in jails. Well, we've had a few surprises since then, which is how we get to the second vulnerability, which is what happened after Plata. So the first thing that happens is that we've taken more than 30,000 people out of the state prison system, and we've moved them out to jails. Some counties did a lot of thinking around this and thought, well, maybe we don't need to send this many people, to prison or jail in the first place. We should find all kinds of alternative sentencing. Some counties freaked out and said, let's just build more jails and add more beds, right? Adding to the capacity. So we have an uneven situation between the different jails in the county. Now, on top of everything, the assumption that the jails couldn't possibly be worse than the state turns out not to be true. And now, rather than litigating against one big prison system, we also are litigating around 58 different systems. And if we're going to come up with a system to combat something like a huge health threat, very difficult to coordinate, as opposed to talking to one master, because now you have 58 different sovereigns managing this. So this is part of the problem. But the other part of the problem was how the federal court required that the population be reduced. So if you look at similar litigation in Europe, because there has been human rights litigation about overcrowding in prisons in Europe and lots of countries in the world, and typically the way that they do it is there are human rights standards for what's the minimum area that a person needs in order to just get their immediate survival needs met. Like what's the basic square meterage that a person needs, right? So typically what they would do is they would require a prison system to meet that area requirement. We didn't do that, and this is partly because federal courts are very shy about intervening too much in the way that state does reforms and are more hesitant about sticking their hand into the state wallet. So instead, what the federal court said was, we're not going to tell you how to do it. Whichever way you do it is fine, as long as you overall reduce the population. What this means is that while the state eventually, years after, met the benchmark and managed to get that many people out of the prisons, they didn't get them out of the prisons evenly, which means that even now, when you look at the day-to-day statistics of prisoners at the California Department of Corrections, you're going to see some places where the prison is at 100% capacity and other prisons that are no better off than the way they were before Plata. They're still close to 200% capacity. And in those places, you still have just as much risk of contagion and poor health care and just like inability of the system to meet basic needs and keep people alive as you did before the litigation. And that is the problem when you're shy about what you're asking and when you're shy about what you're getting. So now we find ourselves in a situation where we still have prisons that are packed with people. We have to figure out what's going on with a lot of jails. We're talking to a lot of different people who have different policies, and we have to kind of somehow wrangle some public policy that makes sense out of it, which is where the third vulnerability comes in. The thing that we need to do now is to release tens of thousands of people, not the 3,500 people that the governors let out, a lot more, orders of magnitude more people. And the problem is that as a state, we have always been very concerned about letting people that we call violent offenders out. Even when we did the reforms in 2011, the legislature was very careful crafting the reforms so that the people that were going to get out were the non-serious, non-violent, non-sex offenders, under the assumption, perhaps, that those people were less dangerous. It turns out that this assumption is not true. There is robust social science to show that people that have been convicted of violent crimes decades ago are a lot less likely to reoffend than somebody who got convicted for a so-called nonviolent offense a couple of months ago. Those are also people who are not only less likely to reoffend, but they're also older because they're doing a longer sentence in prison, and they're also sicker because spending decades in prisons is very detrimental to your health. So we end up in a situation where the people that it's kind of like it's the least political expedient people to release, the folks that make headlines, the Manson family, that kind of folks, right? The folks that were sort of making a big noise in the comments every time there's a newspaper story about them, right? Those are exactly the folks that are actually not risking public safety at all. They're most at risk at dying from the virus, and they're the people that need to be let out. Unless you think that there's just a handful of people like that, a quarter of the California prison population is people doing very, very long sentences. Like 25% at least of the California prisons is people that are either life without parole or life with parole, or some kind of sentence like 50 or 70 years that basically means life. They're never getting out alive, right? Those are precisely the people that are going to get sick. Now, it's true that politically it's difficult to sell publicly the idea that you need to let these kinds of folks out. But keep in mind that even if the person deserves whatever they got, first of all, there's the question if the person's already done 45 years, you're going to let them out, a year before, like what really is the 46th year adding to your sense that justice has been done, right? But even assuming that they deserve the sentence, nobody deserves to die from a terrible disease in prison without good health care. That was not one of the outcomes that the court would have foreseen. And even the folks that would argue, you did the crime, you got to do the time, you don't have to do this. It can be anything, but it can't be this. All of which is to say, this is a risk to all of us because whatever happens in prison comes out via the staff to the general population. But even if you don't buy this bigger argument, which is strongly supported epidemiology-wise, consider the fact that even people behind bars are human beings just like you, and they need to get treatment, and they need to not get sick, and they do not deserve to die because of medical neglect and because of the oversights that we've done for decades in the state.
So, Professor Aviram, what you're describing is a reaction to a pandemic in some ways. And I'm wondering if after this moment, we tried to get ahead of this problem, what policies would you put in place and recommend, if you could recommend any?
Rahm Emanuel said after the financial crisis to a group of people in a different context that it's a shame to let a good crisis go to waste. And this is exactly, I think, what's going on now. I think that what we're probably going to see with these big releases is that crime rates are not necessarily going to go up. For a variety of reasons. First of all, crime rates are now generally down just because of the pandemic. People are at home, people are not committing crime. But even so, we are experiencing in the last several years crime rates that are very, very low. Basically the lowest crime rate since the 60s. The reason you occasionally read in the paper about somebody who's just got released for COVID-19 reasons and they were caught prowling somewhere or whatever is because crime is actually not that common. That's why it makes headlines. It's hideous, but it's also very rare. Right? And I think that this is a real opportunity for us to think as a state, maybe as a nation, do we really need all of those people for prison? Do we really need them in prison for such a long time? Do we really need people in their 50s and 60s and 70s behind bars? I think that there's a lot to think about here that, if considered properly, might transform how we go forward after this pandemic is in the rear mirror.
You had a line earlier when you're discussing the current situation, and you said that part of the reason we're here is because we shouldn't be shy about asking for what we really want. So I want to put that question back to you. For people just listening to this podcast, what are some actions that they can take that might achieve these goals?
Write to your California Assembly person, write to your California senator, write to the governor, and demand that they release more people. For everybody's sake, we have got to save lives. If we don't let tens of thousands of people out of prison who are not risking you in any way, except for if they get sick, the California Department of Corrections is going to become a mass grave within a few weeks. We can prevent that if we act quickly. But that means you have to put a lot of political pressure, and you have to basically convince your elected officials to do the right thing.
Are there any organizations bringing lawsuits to help achieve this goal?
There is a lawsuit ongoing against the governor. It's being brought up by inmate representatives and organizations, by the prison law office, by a law firm that did the original overcrowding case, trying to get the state to release more people. So far, the courts have not been responsive to that. They've been receiving all kinds of procedural, come and go, we're not going to take the case. This other court needs to take the case. And every day that one of these technicalities is standing in the way of releases is another day where we're risking hundreds and thousands of deaths. This is why it's crucial for the governor to do the right thing without waiting for the resolution of the lawsuit.
Thank you for sharing with us today, Professor. We really do appreciate that, and you make a very compelling case, and I hope our listeners will take that to heart. Is there anything else you want to add as we're looking out, say, over the next year, 2 years, 3 years before we have a vaccine and can end this crazy pandemic time?
Sure. So one reason why I'm keeping hope is that I know that Gavin Newsom is a very brave man. I know that he did the right thing in the early 2000s with same-sex marriage in California, in San Francisco as mayor. I know that he did the right thing with a moratorium on the death penalty just a year ago, just fearing the fact that he would be sending innocent people to their deaths. And when it takes a lot of courage, he has that courage and he can act. But he's going to act only if we put pressure on him to do so. And I'm really, really calling out to all of you to do what you can to convince him to do the right thing.
For more information and additional resources related to this episode, please visit our website at www.uchastings.edu/pandemic.
And while you're there, you can check out all the episodes in this series. Thanks for listening.